Hi, thanks for joining. Today, nice quick little video on how to persist application settings to the App.config file. So when you're, you have an application and, maybe it's a Windows form application, you move the form around the screen, and whenever you exit the application and you restart it, you'd like the form to come back up where you left it. That's what I'm going to demonstrate today. And just knowing how to do that, then you can, by extension, figure out how to persist your other properties. Essentially, it's pretty easy to do. And, the improvements to C# make it a whole lot easier. So, all right. So a word about my environment. I'm running Visual Studio 2015, but I'm running it in a VM on a Mac, okay, Big Mac Pro, running Windows 2010, okay. So you'll see some goofy stuff, like when I go up here, there's the menu, right? So there's Visual Studio running in its window. I'm running Parallels on the Mac called Unity, or Coherence, I guess, is their term for it, right? So, I also have a menu up here on the Mac menu bar for this thing. So that's why you see some strange stuff in the output. All right, just let you know what I'm doing. Okay, so first I'm going to create a project in Visual Studio called Persist Settings. So it's going to be a Windows form application, okay? So make sure Windows form is checked. I'm going to have the create directory for solution, and I'm saving it in my C:\projects directory, and it's called, I'm just going to call it Persist Settings, and click OK. And then the first thing you want to do, once you do a project, I do this whenever I first start a project, is as soon as it loads up, I'm going to run it from the debugger just to make sure that everything in the template built correctly. It usually does. Okay, so now this is my project, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to the Start and click Start, and then it should pull up that window. So it should build the project. Okay, and you see down at the bottom of the screen, right, that's the progress. And then, okay, so now we have over here on the right, it's got some diagnostic tools, which will pop up here in a second. Okay, and you can change the size of the window, right, like that. Okay, so everything's running fine. All right, so I'm going to stop that, and then I'm going to double click Form 1 just to make sure I can pull up my form code. Okay, and there's my form code. Alrighty. Now, I don't need to change the name of my Form 1, but I'm going to do it this time. So, let's see here. I think what I want to do is I'm going to go over here and go Rename. I'm going to click on the Form 1, and I'm going to rename this Main Form. Just like that. And it should say, you're renaming. Would you also like to perform a rename? Yes. Make sure you check yes on that. I'm going to save, and then you'll see the output down here at the bottom. I'm going to save the project, and then I'm going to double click on main form again. Okay, and okay, so the class has been changed, the constructor's been changed, fine. The only thing that hasn't changed is the name of the form. That's the original text, right? Title. That's the title of the window, and we can change that down here in the properties. Hey, there it is right there. Main form. Just like that. Now we're all good to go. But I'm going to change it. I'm going to change that title. I'm going to say Persist properties. Okay. Okay, now, what do you need to persist properties? There's many different ways of going about it, right? Back in the day, you wrote custom solutions. You could persist them to the registry. Some people don't like to do that. I certainly don't like to mess around with the registry. But you could persist them to a database. You could write your own custom, persist them to a text file, read it in. There's many different ways to do it, right? But I think the easiest way is just to use what Microsoft provides as far as the App.config file goes, right? And that's up here in the properties. So you've got this properties section. Here's your solution, right? We have our solution name, Persist Settings. Here's our project, Persist Settings. Underneath that, we have properties. If you expand the properties, you'll see assembly info. I have to do a video on that to explain what that's all about. Resources and settings. So if we open up settings, we have our settings that we can add for the application or the user. Okay. Now, so you'll need to add settings, okay, that correspond to the settings that you want to persist in your application. And this is where you'd add them. So when you add a setting here, it goes into the App.config file, okay? And I'll have to show you. I'll show you as soon as we start putting settings in. All right, so back to the settings. So if you just click on the file in Visual Studio, right, it displays it. So that's what it did right there. All right, so back to the settings. So you need settings, and then you need some type of method, right, that you need some code to read the settings and initialize your object, right, your class or your application from the settings that are located in the application.config or app.config file. Then you need a way in your code that whenever your application exits, you need to be able to save those settings to the app.config file. So those three things I'm going to show you how to do. All right, so I'm going to start by creating 3 settings. And the 3 settings I choose are going to be pretty simple. They're going to be the form width, the height, and the location. So whenever we open up the application and we move the form around the screen, we're going to, and then we close the form, next time we open it, it'll pop up right where it was. Okay? So the first setting is I'm going to call it main form height. And I'll make this an integer. Now, in order for a property to be read-write, in other words, in order for you to persist the value of a property, it has to be scoped user. It has to be user scope. If you make it application scope, it's only read-only. That's a little gotcha right there. So I'll make the value, initially I'll make the value 400, like that, for the width, or for the height. Okay, maybe I'll make it 200 for the height. Doesn't really matter. Now the next setting name I'm going to create is main form width. And I'm going to make that an integer as well. And I'll make that 400. Okay. The next one I'm going to create is main form location. Now the location property, as you'll see here in a second, there's a little bit of a gotcha with the location property, but form width and form height, those are pretty straightforward. This is the form location is actually a point, so you have to come down here to system drawing point. Now if you don't see a setting that corresponds to the property you want to persist, you can browse the properties, right? And then you get all these different libraries that you can search through for the different things. Practically anything you want, you could probably persist it. All right. So I'm going to make this a point, system.drawing.point. Let me slide that out there so we can see. User scope. And I'm just going to say the starting location will be 200 pixels from the, I guess it's XY or XY. To the right, from the upper location of the screen, upper left, 200, like that. So that's our initial properties. And to demonstrate this, all we need, you only need one really, but I picked these 3. All right, so save your settings. All right. Now go back to your form. You can close this now. Go back to your form. I'm going to stretch this out a little bit. There's really no need to put anything else in here. It'll just be the form when it runs, right? But what we want to do is we want to double click on the form and get back to the code here. Now, all this stuff here, Visual Studio has already added this stuff for us, right? I'm going to save this. So this is the partial class main form, and it extends form. We can edit this all day long, right? If you go to formdesigner.cs, open that up, then this is where the generated code is, and you don't want to mess around with any of this stuff, right? For the most part, unless you know what you're doing. Okay, so here what I want to do is, going back to those three things that we need, we added our settings. That's the first thing we need. So we've got 3 settings that we want to persist. Now we need a method that loads those settings, you know, when the application starts, right? So here's the constructor, right? This is a partial class. So here's our main form constructor, and it's already calling the initialize component method, which is located over here in the main form, right? Here's our initialize component method right here. This is in the file that I just told you not to mess around with, right? So you don't want to mess around with that. So we're going to add our own, and I'm going to call it initialize main form. So private void initialize main form, like that. Open brace, closing brace. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to read in the properties and set the properties from the properties file and set the property for the form, right? So to get to the form, since we're in the main form, right? Object-oriented programming, this is our class main form. It extends form, then we have direct access, right, to the public properties that are on the form itself. So, and I like to distinguish, you know, it draws my attention to the fact that I'm actually accessing a property in the base class by saying this. Okay, so this dot I want to say this dot width or height. Let's start with height equals, and here's how you access the App.config properties dot settings dot default dot main form. Okay, there's our 3 properties that we or settings that we added, right? And I'm going to say main form height, just like that. Okay. Now we'll do the same thing with the width. Equals properties default dot main height, or main form width, just like that. Now, okay, so finally, location. Equals properties settings dot default dot location. Oh, main form location. Alrighty then. Now, okay, so the thing about this location, right, is well, let me just run it and I'll demonstrate, right? Let me run this thing first. So we save it and we run it. Okay. Let's just go start. Now, in order to actually demonstrate how this thing works, we'll need to actually run it from the debug folder. I'll show you how to get there. We won't run it in the debug mode per se. So, all right, so here's our window as it pops up with the default settings, right? Let's go start again. All right, so it just pops up there. Now when we change it, see, because we're not persisting, it'll just go back to its original settings. All right, and you notice how the window started up here and more up towards the left, right? So we come back down. Let's move it again, right? Move it. We're not persisting anything, so we don't expect it to maintain these settings. Okay, so then we hit start again. All right, so now it started in like, it looked like a little different location, right? There's no rhyme or reason to that. Okay, so let's actually not run it from here, right? Well, no. Let's do this. In order to actually, so those locations aren't being used yet, right? These properties are not being used yet because this method, initialize main form, I have to put that method, I have to call that method from the constructor. So I have to say initialize main form. So now when I run this thing, whatever those, it'll load these settings from the app.config. And now whenever you add settings via the settings here, those settings are placed in the app.config. So here's the application config. Here's our user settings. Okay. And here's setting main form height 200, main form width, there's another setting 400, and here's another setting, main form location. Serialized, it's serialized as a string, see? So if you see that it's serialized as a string, well, they're all strings, right? Okay. 200. App config, get rid of the settings. Okay. But you'll notice that we don't really, it's actually kind of, it's going to do this conversion for us. So you watch this, right? This is pretty cool. Now this is going to pull a little surprise because there's another property that we have to set in order for the location, the manual location, to actually function. Okay, so let's build the solution. This time we're just going to build it. Okay, I would say that, so the build succeeded. Now what we're going to do is I got to go to I have to go to the directory. So let's pull up the File Explorer, go to the C drive, find the projects directory, find the project. There's the project directory. And it usually, whenever you build in the debug, we go to, there we go. Okay, so here's the file that was just created, and here's the config. So let's take a look at Persist settings configuration file first. I'm going to edit it with Notepad++. Okay. So there's our settings. Everything's in the settings file, right? So we're ready to go. Now let's run it. So we just double click. And so there's the dimensions that we've set the window to be, right? Now we move around, right? It's not going to persist, but okay. Those are our window dimensions. Now, how do we save these? How do we actually get, well, let's do this. Go back and run it. The trick is, how do I get my window to stay right here, right? If I want my window to stay in this location, I'm already setting the location, but it doesn't seem to be taking effect, right? So, right. I'm not, at this point, I'm not saving, okay? Just to be clear, I'm not saving my settings yet, right? So anytime I move it, those settings are not going to be persisted. It's only the default settings at this point, all right, that are being that are rendering. Oops, that are rendering the window, right? So now let's save the settings. All right. So I want to create, but how do we do that? All right. What we want to do is we want to respond to an event. Okay. So you could actually save the settings every time the window moved, right? But how do we figure out what type of events we can respond to? All right. Well, we go to MSDN, right? Let's make this a little bit bigger here. And we're going to look for events that seem like a natural thing. So here's the form class documentation. I'm going to go to events. Okay. And these are, when it pops up here, these will be all the events. There's all kinds of events that we can respond to, right? Well, first off, in our code, there's already a form load. Okay. But that doesn't do us any good when we want to actually persist the settings. So what we want to do is find something that maybe, you know, like when we close the form, right? That'd be one candidate. All right, so let's scroll down here and we have form closed. We have form closing. Probably form closing. Yeah, there's all kinds of different methods, right? But that's probably the best, form closing. So we click on form closing, and what we need to do is figure out, like, okay, how do we actually create this? So there's a delegate, right? It's form closing event handler. We have to find the delegate. So let's see here. Here we go. This will tell us how to write the form closing event handler. All right. So what it does is, you know, a delegate. There's another video I have out there on delegates and creating delegates and explaining what a delegate is. But essentially, it's a method that's going to handle the event, and it's our method that we create, and it has to have two arguments. Object is the first argument, and one with form closing event args. Okay. So all this type of information you have to glean from the MSDN documentation. And as you build up competency in C# programming, next thing you know, it's like, oh, you start memorizing all this stuff, right? Okay, so we have to create a method. So I'm gonna call this method main form closing event handler. So private void main form event handler. Okay, and the first argument is object. Now this right here, right, is that's the parameter. You can name the parameter anything, but by convention, it's usually sender. So that's the object that actually sends the event. All right, sender, and then form closing event args. Okay, there we go. It's completing it for me, and I just put E. All right, even if you don't use the event args, you still have to have them in there. All right, now, so what I want to do here is whenever the form whenever the form is in the process of closing, I want to save my settings. Okay, so I want to say properties dot settings dot default dot, and then whatever property I'm saving. So main form height. Start with the height equals, okay, this dot height. All right, now properties dot settings dot default dot main form width. Okay, equals this dot width. And properties, finally, properties dot settings dot default dot main form location equals this dot location. So okay, now, so we've got this event handler method. Now we have to wire up the form's event. So this, I'm going back up to my initialize form, the initialize form main form method, and right below where I've loaded my settings, I'm going to register my event handler for the form closing event. Form closing. So anything with a little lightning bolt is an event. Form closing plus equals or I'm going to say main form closing event handler, just like that. Okay. Now let's run this. Okay. Let's build the solution, because we're going to run it from the debug directory. Build the solution. Okay. Let's minimize this window here. Let's go to Windows Start menu. I should have kept that open, but I didn't. File Explorer. C. projects, persist settings, bin. All right. Now, so persist settings. Now, okay, so here I'm moving it around, and now I'm going to change the width and the height. I'm going to close it. I'm going to start it. All right, that didn't work, did it? Oh, okay. So, important point. Let's go back to the code here. I forgot one thing. You'll do this too when you're programming. So down here, I've set the settings, right? But I forgot the most important thing. Properties.settings.default.save. All right. Sometimes you make mistakes. It depends on what type they are. So yeah, usually you got to remember, save those settings. Now let's run this thing again. So let's build it. Okay. All right, let's minimize. Now let's run it again. All right, now let's move it around. Change the width, change the height. Okay. Now let's close it. Now let's run it again. Okay, so width and height are persisting, right? And let's move the location down here somewhere and change the width and height just to demonstrate here. So the location obviously is down here in the lower, right quadrant of the screen. Hit close and then persist settings. So the window's not staying where I want it to stay, right? The window's not staying where I want it to stay. So why is that? Well, it turns out there's an interesting property that we have to take into account. Okay. And that property is called the start position for the window, right? So we have to come back up here to the initialized form, and we have to say this dot start position. Start position equals. Now there's a form start position. You see how it's populating? My IntelliSense is populating. Form start position. There's all kinds of different start positions. We can start the form in the center of the screen or in the center of the parent, right? In other words, Windows can have other windows as their parent. We can start it in the center of the screen, which would be whatever the screen you run it on, or manual, or window default bounds, or Windows default locations. If you don't set if you don't set the form width and the form height, then Windows default bounds is what it defaults to. Okay, and then the Windows default location, it'll usually pop up in the same spot most every time, right? We want manual for this to work. And what that says is, hey, I want to use the location. What this says is when the start position is set to form start position dot manual, okay, it will use the location property. So we're reading in the location property, and we were reading in the location property, and we were persisting the location property, but because form start position was not set to manual, it was ignoring the start position that we were setting and using the Windows default bounds, or Windows default start position, or location, I should say. All right, now that we've got start position set to manual, let's save the code. Let's build. Actually, if you just build, it will save it for you. Okay, and once that builds, we can go back and run it again. Building. Uh-oh. Oh, you know why? Because I think I have not, whenever you get something like that, if there's something running in the background, oh, I didn't think I had a window running. All right, let's see here. Let's start that and see what happens. No. All right. All right, now I have build errors. Now I'm wondering what happened here. Okay. Okay, I had a window that was still running. I had to shut that window down. So if you still have a project that's running and you try to build it over top of it, then it will give you an error. All right, so let's build this thing again. I had to just close that window. All right, so build succeeded. All right, let me minimize this, go back here and run. All right, so see, it was in that small position, right? That was the last one it did. So let's make this bigger. Okay, now, so I'm moving my window around. I'm going to put it down here in the lower left-hand quadrant, and I'm going to close it. Now I'm going to start it again. All right, so so that was a trick. We have to set start position to manual in order for the location property. Okay, and, you know, that's for Windows. That's probably the trick, right? If you're not persisting window form properties, then you probably don't have to worry about that too much, right? Actually, that start position I think is on a control, or maybe it's just on a window. I have to research that myself. Okay, so to recap, to persist settings, right? You need to have three things. You need to have the settings, right, that you want to persist. You put those in the settings. You enter those into the settings, and then that builds your App.config file. The settings is really just a user-friendly. Let me pull up the code again. The settings is really just a user-friendly way to put, you know, inner settings into your program. The whole purpose of the settings interface is to populate your application config file. Okay, so here's our settings, right? Notice these are still set at the default values. Now if we go, this is a good point, right? So let's go here. So we run the program, and we move the screen around, right? And we close it, and then we run it again. So it's obviously persisting these settings, right? Let's take a look at our app config. I'm going to edit this again in Notepad++. And we can see that has not changed. Oh, okay. All right. I bet I know where they're located. All right, so let's close this down. Let's close all these dumb programs here down. All right. All right, so I'm running this file, right? And this actually answers another question that you're probably going to have. Is like, okay, well, what happens when multiple users use an application and user A sticks the window down here and user B sticks the window up here? Which one's going to be used? All right. Well, I'm user A, and so all my settings, right, whenever I open and close the window, they're going to go to something that's obviously local to me. So let's go back to local disk, users, me, app data. So here's our app data folder, and usually you can't see it. It might be hidden, right, unless you're the administrator. Local, right? And oh, persist settings. There we go. That's where it's at. Let's see. I don't even know if I can edit that. Is that a file folder? 10. Okay, user. Okay, so let's go back here. See this 1000, right? I'll show you probably where that comes from here in a second. So user config. This is our configuration file. Bada bing, bada boom. So there's our last. So what we'll do is we'll close that, right? We'll go back. We'll keep that window open, right? Let's open up another window. Like I said, the reason I do some of the crazy things I do here is because I'm running this in parallels on a Mac, even though I'm running Windows 10. All right, let's go to projects, right? Persist settings. Persist settings, bin, debug. Now let's run it. Okay, so now let's open up these user config. Okay, they change, right? And I'll just leave that open actually. So notice that these values here, right? Now I'm going to run this program again. Okay, and I'm going to, let's see if that causes an error. So I'm going to save that. Now when I try to reload it, I get the reload. Yes, I like to see the new values. So when I hit OK or yes, you're going to see these values change over here. Bing. These did. All I did was move the window. So if I resize the window and move it, you'll see all these values change. Let's do that. All right, so I think you're going to get the point, right? So move the window and resize the window and hit save. Now click on Notepad++, reload all the values. Boom, changed. Okay. Okay, so now to, oh yeah, why? So where does this 1.1 come from? Let's go back here. So we have this folder, right, within our app data local persist settings, persist settings.executable, right? We have 1000. Let's go see where that comes from. Remember that assembly info file I told you about? Let's take a look at it. There's our assembly version right there, an assembly file version. So this is obviously we haven't messed around with that. And so we're just using assembly. This is our first version of this program. So it's saving the configuration settings in the assembly version 1.0.0.0. Okay. Alrighty. So again, to review, 3 things you need. 1, you need settings. You put the settings in the settings file. This puts settings in your App.config. When you run the application, and then you need events. So in your main form, or wherever you put them, right? I'm just using a very simple program here. You have to have a method that, you know, reads in those properties from the application config, okay? And then you have to have an event that whenever something occurs to persist those settings to the configuration file, okay? And then how do different users, how do their settings get saved in a different file? It goes to the local user app data folder for whatever version of the program is running. And so every user has their own version of their settings for that application. Okay, I hope this was helpful, and I appreciate your time for sitting there listening to me babble on about properties. Have a great day.